So Panama is, in some ways, your average Caribbean country. Areas like Bocas del Toro are a collection of trip photos waiting to be taken. And Panama City sees a solid Carnival celebration. It's also a hotbed of musical talent. For one thing, even though the origin of reggaeton can be a controversial subject, the genre probably originated in Panama. And for another, Soundway, one of the world's greatest hunters and re-releasers of quality world music, compiled not one, but 3 amazing album-length collections of Panamanian groovers. Let's just say that the world has seen an unusually large and amazing output of music from the country, and it's an extremely small nation, the size of the U.S. state of South Carolina. So beautiful scenery, punching above its weight culturally, that sounds about right for the region. But ads for Panamanian tourism aren't widespread like those of some Caribbean countries. Even though it has a vast amount of parkland, it's certainly not a niche ecotourism destination like its neighbor, Costa Rica. So why is this? Well, this is where Panama deviates heavily from the Caribbean norm and that of Latin America in general. Panama doesn't push tourism because it just doesn't need the money. The nation contains what is by far the easiest way to ship goods between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, the Panama Canal. In addition to hosting this vital piece of the global shipping industry, Panama has also become a major financial center, partially to handle money generated by the canal. The country's GDP per capita, which can be looked at as sort of the average income in any nation, is $15,000, which is pretty low by a lot of standards, but is very high for a nation its size in Latin America. Now, a massive infrastructure project like the canal doesn't happen on its own. Although Panama controls the canal and its surrounding area today, that was not always the case. The involvement of the United States in Panama has been extensive, and often not with the best interests in mind for Panamanians. Now, there are similarities here with Egypt's Suez Canal. It's a massive artificial waterway built with European money and expertise, and a lot of local laborers died during construction. But Panama's relationship to the USA has more of a parallel in the former British colony of Hong Kong. On Chinese land essentially stolen by the United Kingdom, the city of Hong Kong blew up as a financial capital during the years following Mao's takeover in China. Basically, the Chinese state would trade with no one but Hong Kong, and the British colony could trade with anyone, making it essentially a funnel for money and goods in and out of China. Things snowballed, and for a long time, Hong Kong was the stock market capital of Asia, and it's just a really amazing city. Now, Panama is not Hong Kong, and in some ways it's not even fair to compare them. Even Panama City, the nation's capital, is sleepy in comparison to the frenetic pace of Hong Kong. And the Asian city-state's relationship to England, and again it was a colony of the UK, is nothing like that of Panama's to the US. The UK was basically renting Hong Kong, and when its lease was up, Hong Kongers had hopes that the British would try to extend it, but that didn't happen. In 1997, China took possession of Hong Kong, and these days, that change of ownership isn't going too well. In fact, many Hong Kongers have left the city entirely in 2 waves. First to Vancouver, Canada, and then to Taipei, the capital of Taiwan. In contrast, Panama's officials have recently reached out to the Chinese, hoping to form a relationship, which would be a slap in the face to the United States. And it's hard to blame them for it. Although the canal was long a U.S. territory, similar to how Hong Kong was a British colony, the United States has been a brutal bully to Panama since well before it was its own nation. Moving goods across Panama was a project first imagined well before the USA even existed. Panama exists on what's known as an isthmus, a thin bridge between 2 bodies of water, and goods crossing it was sort of a no-brainer. The Spanish thought about it shortly after their invasion of the Caribbean even. But the canal's history as a busy connection between oceans basically begins with the discovery of gold in California in 1848. Tens of thousands of would-be miners would make the trek from their homes on the East Coast to San Francisco, and many passed through Panama, taking a ship to Central America, crossing through the jungle, then taking a second ship to San Francisco. The cross-continental trip took 40 days. Going over land, getting from the Atlantic seaboard to California took 7 months, and that's if you were lucky. Now, at this point in history, the modern-day countries of Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, and Panama were all one huge nation, known at the time just as Colombia, but referred to by historians as Grand Colombia. They were making a whole lot of money, letting Western industries move people and goods throughout Panama, especially after a railway was constructed in 1858. They were poised to make even more profit after they made a deal with the French to allow a canal to be built through Panama. But while construction started in 1881, the French would eventually abandon the project and progress was stalled. Enter the United States. Power grabs today can be subtle, but this one was not. Under President Theodore Roosevelt, the United States openly gave its support to a small Panamanian independence movement. It helped oppose the current leadership and was the first country to recognize newly independent Panama as a new nation. To really drive the point home, U.S. battleships surrounded the country just after independence. Now, this was, at the time, widely condemned by anyone with a sense of morality in the U.S. and abroad, but Roosevelt and the U.S. administration just kept tightening their grip on the new nation. Soon enough, there was a canal, and the U.S. established a Puerto Rico-like territory surrounding it known as the Canal Zone, which was part of the U.S. but not a state. Life in the zone was great, if you were representing the USA. The locals were literally second-class citizens. They were paid in silver, while the U.S. military and workers were paid in gold. Now, words like apartheid and Jim Crow have a lot of weight behind them, and we're not saying they necessarily apply to the situation in the Canal Zone, but it is a fact that those phrases have been used in reference to that era. It was messed up. Needless to say, this was far from a bright spot in the history of U.S. diplomacy, and that history itself is pretty dark. This was all complicated by the rule of Manuel Noriego, the Panamanian dictator whose troubled reign was ended by direct U.S. military intervention in 1989. The name of the operation, Just Cause, was nicknamed Just Cuz, and riots after the overthrow resulted in the locally infamous Day That George Bush Cried. On this day, protests against a speech by Bush I after the intervention resulted in tear gas drifting on stage into the eyes of the President and the First Lady, who were quickly evacuated. Anyway, U.S. actions on the Isthmus ended with the canal ending up in complete Panamanian control in 1999 due to a deal made with President Jimmy Carter. Or supposedly. Let's just say that China wrestling Panama out of the U.S.'s sphere of influence would be a pretty brazen move. We'll wrap this video up by talking about the Panama Canal itself. The canal sits on one of 3 routes that were considered for a canal at some point, the other routes being one that passes through Nicaragua, including that country's large Lake Nicaragua, and one that travels between ports in the 2 Mexican states of Oaxaca and Veracruz. Given the events Panama has seen, I'm not sure these regions regret being looked over. The actual waterway is, by all accounts, an engineering marvel. In the style of much infrastructure, it really messed up the communities it plowed through. But just know that getting ships over land is really hard, so some engineers consider it a wonder of the modern world. Another interesting fact about Panama is that if you try to drive from the US to Chile, you have to stop in the Darien jungle in the eastern part of the country. Panama runs west to east. This jungle is so hazardous to humanity, the construction of this portion of the Pan-American Highway was deemed impossible, leaving the road unconnected due to what is known as the Darien Gap. And these days, with the power of environmental conservationist movements, it's probably never going to happen. Score 1 for Mother Nature there. But anyway, just because Panama doesn't need tourists doesn't mean visiting is a bad idea. Just don't plan on going to Cologne, which is extremely dangerous, even though it's a cultural hotbed. Panama City's pretty sick though, and otherwise, you'd be in for a great trip. This has been an Other Map video. If you enjoyed it, give it a like, and if you feel like watching more, subscribe to get notifications. This video is part of our Caribbean season, so if this was interesting, check that playlist out. Anyway, later on.